Last week I left a pot on the stove for way too long. I was scrolling my phone, half paying attention, telling myself I would check on it in a minute. By the time I actually looked, whatever I was cooking had turned into this unrecognizable, blackened mass fused to the bottom of the pan. I nearly cried. It took me 20 minutes and a metal spoon and pure rage to scrape it off. And the entire time, I kept thinking, how did I ruin something this badly by doing basically nothing? Turns out, ancient humans made almost the exact same mistake. Someone, somewhere, around a fire that was burning far hotter than it should have been, had a rock nearby that was not just a rock. And instead of ruining dinner, that mistake accidentally invented metal. Which makes MS wonder if the actual foundation of human technology started with somebody not paying close enough attention to a fire. Why does my burnt pot still just go in the trash? Hi, I'm Marin Still. And today, I found the moment humans stopped being a Stone Age species. It happened by accident. Nobody planned it. And honestly, once you hear how it actually went down, you will never look at a campfire the same way again. MS is not going to tell you some caveman genius sat down one day and invented metallurgy. That is not what happened. What actually happened is stranger, dumber, and somehow more impressive, because nobody involved had any idea what they were doing. By the end of this, you are going to understand exactly how a mistake around a fire pit turned into bronze, tools, weapons, and eventually, the entire modern world sitting in the room around you right now. Here is where it starts. Long before anyone smelted metal on purpose, people were already using certain rocks for something else entirely. Green and blue stones, ground into powder, used as pigment, used as decoration, sometimes ground up for what looks like early cosmetics or ritual paint. Those stones were malachite and azurite. They looked pretty. Nobody thought they were useful for anything beyond color. They were rocks that happened to be green. Except those green rocks were copper ore. And copper ore has a very particular, very inconvenient property. If you get it hot enough, hotter than a normal cooking fire, something in that rock starts to change. This is where the archaeology gets genuinely wild. At a site called Belivode, in modern-day Serbia, researchers found evidence of copper smelting dating back roughly 7,000 years. That is thousands of years earlier than historians used to assume metalworking began. The researcher behind a lot of this work, an archaeometallurgist named Miljana Radivojevic, studied slag, which is basically the leftover waste material from smelting, and found copper droplets fused into it. Not jewelry, not tools, just accidental proof that someone, somewhere near Belivode, got a fire hot enough by accident to start pulling metal out of rock, probably without any idea that is what they were doing. Picture it for a second. You are tending a fire. Maybe you are firing pottery, which requires fires far hotter than cooking fires, sometimes over 1,000 degrees Celsius. There happen to be some green rocks nearby, maybe used to line the kiln, maybe just sitting there because they were pretty, and slowly, without anyone intending it, the copper inside those rocks starts to separate from the rest of the stone and pool at the bottom, like fat rendering out of meat. Nobody planned that. Nobody was trying to invent anything. Somebody just noticed, probably days later once the fire had gone cold, that there was a strange reddish shiny puddle sitting where a plain rock used to be. Stay with me. It gets weirder. Because copper alone is actually a pretty unimpressive metal for tools. It is soft. It bends. A copper axe dulls fast and folds under real pressure. We actually have direct proof of this. In 1991, hikers in the Alps found a 5,000-year-old mummified man, now known as Ötzi. He was carrying a copper axe. Researchers who examined it found the copper was nearly pure, which tells us people were still working out the basics, still a long way from anything durable. Ötzi's axe looked impressive. It probably did not perform much better than a good stone axe. So copper on its own was not the revolution. The revolution happened when someone, somewhere, likely also by accident, mixed copper with something else, tin. And when you combine copper and tin, you get bronze, which is dramatically harder, holds an edge, and does not fold the moment you actually use it for something. Here is the part that makes MS genuinely uncomfortable. Nobody understood alloying at the time. Nobody knew what an element was. There was no concept of atomic structure or metallurgy as a science. People were combining ores that happened to sit near each other geologically, in rocks that happened to contain both copper and tin naturally, smelting them together without any idea that they were doing something chemically significant. They just noticed that the metal coming out of certain rocks was better than the metal coming out of other rocks. And they kept using the good rocks. At Timna Valley in Israel, archaeologists Thomas Levy and Erez Ben Yosef have spent years studying ancient copper mining and smelting operations, some dating back roughly 3,000 years, showing increasingly organized, almost industrial-scale copper production. What started as an accident around a random fire eventually became a specialized trade, with specific people responsible for finding ore, specific furnace designs, and enough demand that entire economies formed around it. All of that traces back to somebody, thousands of years earlier, being confused about why a green rock turned into a shiny puddle. And this is the detail that gets MS every time. The people who figured this out were not applying a theory. There was no theory yet. They were pattern matching from pure repetition. This rock, in this fire, at this heat, makes this stuff. Do it again. See if it works again. It did. So they kept doing it, generation after generation, slowly refining a process nobody could actually explain, purely because it kept producing tools that worked better than the tools they had before. Which is, when you actually sit with it, an unbelievably human thing to do. We still do this constantly. We keep a recipe going because it worked once, without fully understanding the chemistry of why. We repeat a routine because it produced a good result, without ever really investigating the mechanism. Ancient humans stumbled into the Bronze Age the exact same way I stumbled into ruining dinner. Not through understanding, through paying just enough attention to notice that something changed, and just enough curiosity to try it again. The difference, obviously, is what happened next. My burnt pot went in the trash. Their accident went into spearheads, axe heads, plowshares, and eventually currency, weapons, and entire empires built on the assumption that bronze was simply better than stone. A mistake around a fire pit turned into the literal naming convention historians use for an entire era of human civilization. We do not call it the Stone Mistake Era. We call it the Bronze Age. And here is the modern slap MS cannot get past. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, someone was almost certainly annoyed. Their good pottery-firing rocks were ruined. Their kiln was a mess. There was a weird shiny puddle where a useful stone used to be, and it probably looked, to them, exactly like my burnt pot looked to me. A failure, a mess to clean up. Nobody in that moment felt like they had just witnessed the beginning of metallurgy. They probably felt like they had wasted a fire and ruined a rock. It took someone else, later, noticing that the ruined rock was actually sharper, harder, more useful than the rock they started with, to realize the mistake was the discovery. So the next time you ruin dinner, or torch something in the oven, or leave a pot on too long while you are distracted by your phone, you are allowed to feel annoyed. That is a completely reasonable reaction, but somewhere in the back of your mind, remember that the exact same kind of accident, the exact same moment of not paying close enough attention to something getting way too hot, is the reason human beings stopped being a Stone Age species at all. The mess was never separate from the discovery. Most of the time, it was the discovery, just before anyone realized what they were looking at. Hi, I'm Marin Still, and now you can never unknow this.